Pharma spent a small fortune last year, well, they do every year, buying politicians. And one of the things that they buy politicians to prevent is the possibility of you and I buying drugs from Canada at retail, filling prescriptions from Canada or other foreign countries. And the reason that they say that they don't want us to buy, that the politicians who take the money from Big Pharma say that they don't want us buying our drugs from Canada is because of safety, right? Canadian drugs are not as safe. Now, I lived near the Canadian border. I grew up in Michigan near the Canadian border, lived in Vermont for 10 years near the Canadian border, 2 hours away. And I don't recall any stories about Canadians dropping dead all over the place because their drug supply was contaminated. But we are seeing this now here in the United States. There's a compound called NDMA. It is one of the ingredients of rocket fuel. And in fact, it was first, the massive contamination of NDMA was discovered outside of west of Los Angeles in an area where they were actually manufacturing rockets. It gets into the water supply, and it's called what's highly miscible is the word. It means highly, super soluble. You put a couple of drops of it into an aquifer, like, miles and miles of underground water, and within days, it has contaminated all of that water. And you say, how could a couple of drops contaminate all the water? Well, the U.S. Department of, is it the USDA or the FDA? The FDA says that the permissible, acceptable daily human intake is 96 nanograms. That's 0.000096 of 1 milligram. In other words, an amount that's just so insanely tiny. And so, anyhow, that's the 96 nanograms is the maximum that the FDA says we're allowed to take. Well, what they're finding now is some drugs that are manufactured in India using raw materials made in China that are sold in the United States as generics, and by the way, 80% of all drugs sold in the United States are generics, are contaminated by NDMA at levels up to 20 times that 96 microgram threshold. Now, why should we care about this? Well, it's one of the most potent carcinogens out there. It's insanely carcinogenic. Cancer researchers, talk about this. It's also extremely poisonous. A Chinese graduate student, medical student, put a few drops in his roommate's water. It killed him. He thought it would be a joke. A Canadian grad student did the same thing. He put some NDMA in a colleague's apple pie. It killed him. It is insanely poisonous. Now, so ever since 1987, when Congress and the Reagan administration cut a corrupt deal with Big Pharma to ban the import of retail pharmaceuticals in the United States, this dates back to Reagan. This is another thing that Reagan did, 1987. You may no longer fill your prescription with a Canadian pharmacy. That's when drug prices started exploding here in the United States because the pharmaceutical manufacturers have a captive audience. And they're saying those Canadian drugs are not safe, but we would be glad to sell you some contaminated drugs from India. I mean, first it was blood pressure medications. Then it was Zantac, proton pump inhibitor, this anti-upset stomach drug. And not just Zantac, I think I'm saying it right, but all of its generic versions. And now it's starting to look like, well, not starting to look like, now they've identified this in metformin. Metformin is a drug that doctors give to people who typically are overweight and are at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And they also give it to people in the early stages of type 2 diabetes because it helps the body regulate blood sugar. It is the most widely prescribed drug in the world right now. And it's now also contaminated by NDMA because these pharmaceutical companies are bringing it in from China and India. Now, if you want the brand name version of any of these drugs, they are available. They're just much more expensive because they're manufactured in Switzerland or in Germany or in Ireland, which is where most brand name drugs are manufactured. Most of the generics are manufactured in India. So if we could just get rid of this 1987 law, this Reagan law, that said that it's illegal to import drugs from Canada, then Americans could buy Canadian brand name drugs manufactured in Germany or Switzerland or even in Canada, instead of buying generics here that are probably about the same price as the Canadian brand names. Or better alternative, you know, Democrats for years have been talking about bringing our jobs, our manufacturing jobs, back to the United States. Why don't we bring back our pharmaceutical manufacturing jobs?